This is already the 6th week of Easter. We're coming into the 7th week, I believe. It's we're almost at the end of Easter season, my favorite liturgical season of the year. And I feel sort of sad as we come toward the end of it. But this beautiful text today from John is part of an ongoing series, you may have noticed, through these days and weeks of readings from the Gospel of John, and particularly from what we call the Last Supper Discourse, which is chapters 14, 15, 16, 17. It's quite long, though chapter 17 really is a prayer, but it's part of the whole thing. In terms of literary genre, this is what we call a testament. The great person, and it's always a man, is about to leave to die and knows that death is imminent. And what are the last most important things that he wants to say to his friends and his disciples? And that's what you have here. You have John's rendering of what Jesus wanted to leave to his disciples. We have other examples in the Bible. We have Deuteronomy chapter 30 is Moses' testament. In Acts 20, you have Paul giving his testament in Ephesus before he's heading for Jerusalem, knowing that a terrible fate awaits him there. The second letter of Timothy is actually pretty much the same thing, Paul giving his testament. So, and there are many, many examples outside of the Bible. But to understand that perhaps helps us put it in context. And one person has characterized this long series of chapters as going, going, gone, because Jesus keeps saying, I'm going. And you know the way Mama says, we don't know the way, and Philip, we don't know the way, help. And Jesus says, don't worry, I'm going to give you a viable replacement. You know? So that's kind of the dynamic of it. But there is this theme of abandonment. And, you know, I never liked the Feast of the Ascension because that's what it is. You know, bye-bye, Jesus is saying, I'm not going to be with you in the same way anymore. I will in another way, but there's change involved. And so there is that theme of Jesus knowing that he is leaving them after some time of intimate companionship. But he says, whoever has seen me has seen the Father. That's said just before this passage. And that is fundamental. That is fundamental to John's understanding of who Jesus is. And when I was teaching many years, teaching Gospel of John, I would use the example of a translation, or now we say interpretation. Official translators from one language to another, we tend to say interpretation because there isn't an exact translation from one language to another. But Jesus is the translation or interpretation of God in human language. We don't speak God's language. It's from a whole different plane. But how is God interpreted into human language? And the answer is Jesus. That's very much what John is trying to say in much of this. Now, the other thing to look at in terms of literary form, which I think helps for Lectio, is that this passage is what we call an inclusion. When you read straight through the Last Supper Discourse, it seems so repetitive because it is. Because one theme will be launched, then you have some other things, and then you come back to the same one. And this is a really good example, verses 15 to 21, which is what we have for today. At the beginning, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. And in verse 21, whoever has my commandments and observes them is the one who loves me. So you have the same theme, this connection of commandment and love. And then you can look at what is in between. which is some rather significant things, and we'll come back to that. But I just want to spend a moment first thinking about this connection of commandment and love. I don't think we really think that way. Love is free. You don't have to be constrained by commandment. And some of that gets into a little anti-Jewish interpretation of Jewish law. We don't ordinarily put the two things together, but here the deep understanding within Judaism is the connection between commandment and love. You conform yourself to the commandments out of love, because that's how God's love is manifested to you, and it's how you respond to God. So that's something to think about. There's an odd thing here, and that is the plural, commandments. Nowhere else in John's gospel do we have commandments. We don't have a Sermon on the Mount the way we do in Matthew. We don't have instructions about how to live a good life. We just have the one, and that's in the previous chapter. One commandment: I command you to love one another as I have loved you. So love and commandment do come together there very much. And how do we fulfill the commandment of Jesus? By expressing this love. So let's look at what's in between those two ideas of the connection of love and commandments in verse 15 and verse 21. First of all, verse 16, I will ask the Father who will give you another advocate to be with you always. The translation here is advocate. Sometimes it's paraclete, the parakletos, which is what it is in Greek. Not to be confused with parakeet, which kids like to do. And especially since the Holy Spirit is sometimes imaged as a bird, you can have a fun play with that. The paraclete, the parakletos, is the one who is called upon, and therefore advocate, the one who stands up for you, the one who speaks for you in your place, who defends you, therefore, under threat. So I will ask the Father who will give you another advocate to be with you all the time. This is the replacement for Jesus. The Spirit of truth, which the world cannot accept. Yeah, the world in John's Gospel, it occurs 57 times, that expression, cosmos, in John's Gospel. Almost always negative, and it's certainly negative here too. I ponder the famous bumper sticker, John 3:15, God so loved the world. We tend to think that that's positive, but I'm not sure it is. It may be that even the world, which is so opposed to God, that God can reach out and love even that. So we have to realize that in John's Gospel, that expression is pretty much negative, which is not to say that there aren't wonderful things in the world. Obviously, we're talking about different meanings of the same word. Just to realize that in the semantic world, the language world of John's Gospel, that word cosmos pretty much symbolizes what is set up against God, what is in opposition to God. And that world, in that meaning, cannot accept the Spirit of truth. It neither sees it nor knows it. There's been so much recently about AI, about artificial intelligence, about the threats, the growing threat of how are we ever going to know what's true and what isn't. So I think this is very timely. the power that sets itself up against a God is what cannot accept the Spirit of truth, who a little bit later on in the text is identified as the Holy Spirit. We're not into Trinitarian metaphysics here, remember. The Spirit is what Jesus gives on behalf of God. Luke has his Pentecost scene 40 days, after the resurrection, in which we have fire, tongues of fire and wind and everything. And John's Pentecost is a very simple appearance of Jesus, the evening of the resurrection, where he breathes on them and says, receive the Holy Spirit. Both ideas about how the Spirit comes. But here, it's about this advocate, the one who will stand up for you. In a world of fake news, that I think is quite a challenge. Now, I glossed over it, but now I want to come back to it. The Father will give you another advocate. Hello, another number two. Who's number one? And I think it's Jesus. Jesus is the one who fulfilled that role before, the one who stood up for us, the one who died for us, of course. And because he is leaving, he gives Spirit to do the same thing. So the role of the Spirit, of this advocate, is very much the role that Jesus has already had. And then in verse 18, I will not leave you orphans, but I will come to you. That language of orphan, we're into parental family language here, aren't we? Orphans are those without parents. What parents are we talking about? It's very clear who the Father is in all of this language. The Father is God. What about a mother? Is it possible that Jesus there is using this image of mother for himself? There are many ways in John's Gospel in which Jesus carries the role of Sophia, of wisdom, who is certainly feminine and in some aspects is maternal, is mother. I don't know if you're familiar with a book that came out many years ago by Carolyn Walker Bynum called Jesus as Mother. And it's really an examination of this theme in medieval mystics. So it's not a new thing. And of course, it's Julian of Norwich, and she's toward the end of the tradition. There's just a little reference here about not leaving you orphans, and you just might think of it in that way. So the world will no longer see me, but you will. And on that day, you will realize I am in my Father, and you are in me, and I in you. We can get stuck in the pronouns sometimes, who's in whom here. But it's a triple relationship. That I am both in my Father and in you. And you are also in me, and therefore in the Father. So 3 things I would leave you with this reflection on this beautiful passage. First of all, that Jesus is the giver of the commandment of love. And therefore, to love is to keep his commandment. To keep his commandment is to love. The second thing is this promise of another advocate. Jesus himself has done that. That has been his role. And now he's passing it on to someone else, to the Spirit of truth, with the promise that he's not leaving us forever. He is present to us in a different way. And finally, third, this parental role of Jesus. We don't think about that very much, but there are other aspects in other gospels that are possible too in this. Jesus as parent, and particularly as mother.